So I'm here today with John Vervaeke and Michael Martin. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist who will be known to a lot of my viewers from his work on Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Michael Martin is a philosopher, a poet, a musician. He's written several books, and one of his primary emphasis is in Sophiology. And kind of what I pitch. I mean, you guys can kind of go wherever you want with this conversation. Don't feel like there's any rails on it at all. But where I saw a potential point of connection, I thought that if, like, Michael had written a blog post a while back about Goethe's approach to science. And also in his book, Incarnation of the Poetic Word, he talked a lot about the link between Sophiology and Phenomenology. And I saw both of those things like intersecting with what John does like quite a lot. So I thought that that might be sort of like a general framework to point to where the point of intersections might be and where the conversation can get started. I'm going to try to just let you guys talk. If there's something that I think might need clarification for the sake of our listeners, then I'll ask the question. But other than that, I'll try to let you guys just do your thing. So
I should start by just saying I'm not that familiar with your work, Michael. I've listened to one of your podcasts, and I have read about half of Submerged Reality. That gives me some understanding of your work.
Okay, thanks.
Do you mind if I ask which podcast you watched? Was it the one with David Armstrong?
No, I think it was something like Hermetics or something like this. I can't remember.
Oh, yeah. The British guy.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Is that it?
Well, that was a good discussion.
Thanks for tuning in. Yeah.
Well, maybe we could pick a topic we'd like to start on. I'm somewhat familiar on Goethe's New Wave Seeing. I know a bit of it from actually a PhD thesis that I examined, in which there was a lot of discussion about this. I have begun to read, I think it's Bortolt's book on taking
the way of seeing or something like that. What's it called?
Taking appearances seriously. Of course, you talk about it a bit. There's a book on Barfield. I read a bit about it. I don't consider myself an expert, but I have some understanding. People have pointed out to me that the work I do on what I call eidetic adduction is very similar in some ways to what Goethe was doing in the New Wave Seeing, and when he's trying to realize the phenomena, and that's a potential point of connection. If you'd like to start there, or we can start with Sophiology, which I've read quite a bit about, and I'm still not clear what it is. And I don't mean that in a dismissive fashion. I'm having a hard time understanding what its unifying theme is, if I can put it that way.
That makes sense. Well, I guess a good place to start, I suppose, is what Goethe was doing was a kind of precursor to phenomenology. I mean, it's Goethean phenomenology, right? He's just and he was resisting. I was thinking a lot about this over the last few days, is that I think in a way what he was resisting was the language of the science of his day, which I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Midgley or Pierre Hadot.
Yes, very much.
But their criticism was that, and their observation too was that the language of science and the Enlightenment was the language of rape and pillage and conquest. And I think Goethe, as a poet, was, uniquely sensitive to language and what language is and what it means. And I think probably what led him into his phenomenology was resisting that sensibility, that exploitation. I mean, I think if you, Operation Warp Speed, right? It's a rush, and it's a rush to exploitation usually. Not all science, of course. I mean, if there's not a lot of exploitation in the sciences when it comes to your work or to the study of frog species or butterflies, right. But in other areas, it's just dangerously exploitive. And so I think Goethe was resisting that. And he wanted to actually, as a poet, to listen to phenomena and see what they had to say for themselves.
That's a good place to start. I'd like to do that because I'd like to share with you very briefly a project I've been working on. I've been working on it in conjunction with Dan Chiappi. And there's sort of a philosophical side and a cognitive scientific side. I'll briefly reference the cognitive scientific side because I might want to refer to it. We've published 3 papers on the NASA scientists using the rovers on Mars. And what's very, very intriguing about this is the set of skills, even more than sets of skills that they require before you can actually start doing the science on Mars. They look for people who can become the rover and see like the rover and be on Mars. And so what we use that to do was, and this was influenced by Merleau-Ponty, some of my other work, we use that to explore other ways of knowing other than propositional inferential knowing. And so you obviously have procedural knowing how the skills, but before they do that, before the people can learn the skills, they have to be able to see like the rover. They have to know what it's like to be the rover on Mars. And what's really interesting about this will get to Goethe in a sec. What's really interesting about this is they don't have joystick control over the rovers because of the time delay, because it's on Mars. In fact, what they get are flat black and white pictures. But what they do, and Vervaeke, one of the ethnographers, they call it seeing as, is they do all this imaginal stuff. They draw all over it and they color it. And what they do is they play with it in an imaginal way. And then they also do something else. They will enact the rover. They'll do things like they'll say, like one of the, how am I going to position the rover? And here's a rock, and they put their phone down, and then she's on a wheelchair, and she puts her hands up like this. These are the cameras, and she's swiveling her body around in this embodied fashion, right? And so they anthropomorphize the rover, and they technomorphize themselves. That's what Vervaeke calls it. They do this loop, I should say. And so there's this participatory knowing. There's a knowing by conformity. And then that gives them the ability to do the imaginal stuff, the perspectival stuff. And then that puts them in the situational awareness so they can actually do the skills. And then only after all of that can they start doing the propositional theorizing. And so I was very interested in this way in which there's this intermeshing. I was making use of Corbyn's notion of the imaginal, the intermeshing of not imagination for the sake of perception, rather than as in distinction from perception, and how this was being used in all these other kinds of knowing. And then I was exploring an idea of, can we recover from within phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty and a bit of Husserl, what I think was the implicit Platonism within it. And what I mean by that is trying to get a phenomenology of intelligibility. And so what was going on there, especially with what they were doing, the pictures, it was making me think that this is a way of seeing and being, right? Because notice I'm not just stating here, seeing and being, right? And it goes something like this. There's a gestalt that's other than the gestalt of just the parts and whole. Every object is multi-aspectual. Like this is Husserl. I never see the whole object. You can see that it's like the reduction, but I'm trying to do something else. And the idea is, right, I can first of all perceptually and then imaginally extend the aspectuality, but it doesn't come out as chaos. There's a through line of intelligibility. There's a gestalt, but not of the parts and wholes, but of all of these aspects. But the through line is not another aspect. It's something beyond the aspects. And for me, this is something like what Plato was going on about with the eidos, because, you know, eidos originally translates as look, the look of something, the aspect of something. And I think he was trying to get at, you know, after all, you take away all of these relations, there's something that runs through it that makes it intelligible. And the reason why I'm interested in this, one last point, is I'm trying to get back to the notion of a contact and conformity epistemology rather than a Cartesian, Lockean, Humean spectator representational epistemology. Now, I don't know if that, to me, and I'm really, I might be totally in error, but when I'm reading about what Goethe is doing is he's trying to see the plant and he's trying to see the earth phenomena, it sounds very similar to that process. And it sounds like it's trying to engage all these other kinds of knowing beyond the propositional. Now, I don't know if that made much sense to you, Michael. I was trying to be.
Yeah.
So that, and I'll just pause there, and I'd like to hear how you would respond to that.
Well, I think, I mean, like Husserl, I think, you know, was steeped in Goethe, and I think, you know, I'm glad you brought up the example of the cigarette box, right? Yeah. Because the imagination does fill in the details even without our wanting it to, and Corban as well. And I actually, for me, this started in literary criticism. My doctorate's in English literature, and I was really frustrated with literary criticism as political action, where people would read a text and immediately they don't even read the text as it is. They read it in the context of, say, colonialism or feminism or some kind of political gesture. And I remember in graduate school, I said, hey, you guys, cool it for a second. Why don't we see what it says? Right? And I think, and that led me to, in fact, the first chapter in the book that Nate was mentioning, The Incarnation of the Poetic Word. I figured it was time to write something out about this, and borrowing from William Desmond, I called it agapeic criticism, right? Where you don't, it doesn't start from judgment or evaluation, which is a scientific, and I should say, kind of the, it was what Goethe was resisting, and what he saw in Newton and Bacon and Locke, you know, that immediately sizing something up before it even has a chance to speak. And we did with the same thing with people, right? Judge a book by its cover. And I noticed that by, you know, this is, you know, what drove me to study English, is that when when you read poetry, when I read poetry, you know, there's a, when I really read it, when I'm present to it, parousia, right? Parousia, presence. And if you're really present to it, not every single time, but in those beautiful moments where the poem opens up, and it doesn't just open up the poem, it opens up the universe in a way. And almost, and my specialty is in metaphysical poetry. And in those metaphysical poets, not only does it seem to open up to the being of the poet, I mean, you really feel like you know the poet, you know, but also in rare occasions to divinity. And I don't know if you know the story from Simone Weil, where she too, and this is how I started thinking about it, is she was given a book of the metaphysical poets by a French priest, and she was really taken with it, and she took one of George Herbert's poems, Love 3, and translated it into French. And whenever she had a migraine coming on, she would recite this poem to herself. And it's a beautiful poem. And she wrote in a letter to a different priest that when she would start reciting this poem, you know, at first it was like a prayer to her, but then she said, and then Christ himself came down and took possession of me through this, which is, and this is, you know, from a woman from a very secular atheist Jewish background, and who was so intellectually rigorous and honest that she couldn't, you know, she didn't make excuses for herself. She just accepted the phenomenon as they came. And so for me, this exploration into this kind of being, this kind of approach to the world, started with poetry, but then it extends to, I'm a biodynamic farmer, so it extends to my work on my farm, extends to, and I try, and it's really difficult, but I even try to extend this to my relationships with other people, right? To not judge them upon first view.
I know I promise, but doesn't it seem like the kind of approach you're talking about, doesn't it seem like at its core what it is a kind of communion, right? That's true of both the way Goethe is trying to do science, and it's also true of what the poet is doing. It's like it's making an attempt at a communion with being.
That's why Goethe called his method of reverence.
Right.
Right. I suppose what I'm first of all, thank you, Michael. That was very helpful and quite eloquent too. I suppose what I'm saying, Nate, is that I'm trying to understand the epistemology and ontology that is presupposed by communion, and I think it's something like a conformity theory. Aquinas, Plotinus kind of conformity theory of knowing, the deepest kind of knowing. And then the ontology is that the phenomenology of intelligibility is our best access to the structures of being, something like that. And so I'm trying to understand, because I think, like Michael, I do a practice called Lectio Divina that opens up a text in this way, and that's the thing that I'm finding intriguing, and I don't mean in a mercenary way. I mean like wondering about this eidetic adduction. How whenever we sort of get into this being mode and we're opening up in this way, right? We get this disclosure, and I'm wondering, because I know you talk. There's two things I want to say. One is two topics to bring up. One is one of the transcendentals, beauty. Because you talk a lot about that, and D.C. Schindler talks a lot about that in his work, and this idea of that beauty is when the appearances are from the reality, that they're a doorway into the depths of something. So instead of the appearance being a block or something that diverts us, beauty is when the appearance welcomes us and affords us into the depths of something. And of course, this is a extremely Platonic notion that's run right through the symposium. And then I want to connect that to another project I'm working on, which is trying to work out what dialogical practice between two human beings looks like, such that they can mutually afford that in a conversation. And one of the defining features is very similar to what you talked about in the poetry. We've all had it where we have the conversation that takes on a life of its own. What set of skills and virtues can we do that won't make it happen? It's not like that. But what set of virtues and skills, states of mind, commitments can we bring to communication that will, reliably improve it, affording communion? And so I'm doing a lot, because it strikes me that dialogue, the logos, is just the interpersonal extension of eidetic adduction. So I can do I can unveil, the inexhaustible multi-aspectuality of a thing. You can, but then you and I also have different perspectives that expand and can expand on each other. And so trying to bring that out. And what I've noticed, because I do a lot of ethnographic participation. I participate in circling events and insight dialogue and authentic relating, and this own set of practices that I've helped to cultivate. And what I notice is reverence emerges very quickly for people in these practices. They start, and this is from all different kinds of backgrounds. And then they start to, first of all, they have reverence for what they call the we space, or the logos, what's going on beyond. They're all participating in it, but it's beyond all of them. And they have a kind of intimacy with each other, an intimacy with this logos. And then through those, they start to get a sense of the sacred. They start to get a sense of an inexhaustible fount of possibilities, of intelligibility, of ways I could be, ways you could be. But again, not chaotically and random. There is a through line of intelligibility that keeps disclosing itself in an ordered and surprising way, which I think is part of why it's so beautiful. It's ordered and surprising at the same time. And so I mean, I'm really interested in what you think about trying to take what you're talking about, as far as I understand it, and translate it into sets of practices by which people, again, I'm resisting trying to make this a technique. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying ascesis. I'm trying to get, spiritual exercises, transformative practices that increase the chance of this kind of realization in both senses of the word being afforded, occurring, disclosing itself. What do you think about that? Because I'm really interested in that right now, because I think the response to nihilism, the meaning crisis, is not going to be any set of propositions. It's going to be the real and reliable affording of people being able to fall in love with being once again.
Yeah. Oh, for me, I'm glad. I'm so glad I met you.
I know, that's why I wanted to make this introduction, because
it's a return. In a way, for me, I mean, I'll put it succinctly, I guess. It's the return to the village. You know, in the same book I was mentioning earlier, there's a chapter on Robert Harrick, and Robert Harrick, who you probably know from an undergrad English course, but if you read all of his poetry, it's messy. It's basically a description of parish life, but it is, he was an Anglican priest, but it's messy. I mean, it's like part pagan, part Christian. Their love poems to the beautiful maidens, their epigrams making fun of some of the people in the parish, right? And it's just and scholars have not been able to make sense of that. And I realized what he was doing is he's actually describing life as it is. And so for us, for my wife and my family, we have 9 kids. It's we've tried to cultivate, since we moved to this farm, more of a sense of community in our vicinity. And so for instance, we celebrate various festivals here on the farm. We have May Day.
Yeah.
We have Michaelmas. We do 12th night. And so part of it, I think, is becoming part of the rhythm of life with these other people, with others as well, right? Which is why I think the internet, and particularly social media, is really antithetical to that. You don't get to be, everybody said this, right? That people say things on social media they would never say into a person's face, right? Because when you're present to a person, generally speaking, I think with rare exceptions, that openness already starts to happen. Or it doesn't happen in the social media environment. I mean, or at least it's not as conducive to that. So that's part of it, I think. And actually, when you were speaking, it reminded me, and I have not researched into this, although I should, the art of Goethean conversation.
Yes. Is there anything written about this?
I don't know. I've heard about it, but I don't think I've ever read anything of it.
I would love to know about this. And
that's what he was getting at. That's how he's basically, it's the metamorphosis of plants, but with people.
Well, right? But also the question that John asked, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got excited about it. Like but what can you do with this question was a very Goethe question, because he was a very practical individual, incredibly practical, which he basically kind of exploded like all the stereotypes people have about like the poet, right? He was a very practical, successful person.
Yeah, I've always been sort of shocked, and I'm only coming now to understand it retrospectively. But when Nietzsche pronounced an example of the Übermensch, he named Goethe as the best example of what he was talking about, which I thought was very, very interesting. I didn't know much about Goethe at the time, and I basically just saw him as the start of the Romantic movement, and I'm somewhat critical of the Romantics, but now I'm coming to understand it a bit better. Could I ask 2 more questions then?
Yeah.
So one is, and this overlaps with part of my criticism of the Romantics because of the element that they left out of, I think, their attempt to appropriate Platonism and Neoplatonism. So Plato and Socrates are deeply concerned with the possibility of self-deception. It runs as a burning theme through all of the dialogues. And one of my, I guess, standing criticisms of a lot of the romantics, not the early ones like Schlegel, but the more prototypical ones, is this concern for self-deception it seems to be reduced. So let me try and complete an argument here. I think they too readily accepted the Lockean and the Cartesian notion of rationality, which is ultimately the coherence and evidence for your propositions. Whereas the old Platonic notion was, no, rationality is the ability to overcome a self-deception and afford self-transcendence. Those are the hallmarks. And then secondly, there was, I think, and I agree, Michael, with, especially Bacon, putting nature on the rack. There is this rapacious, and the Heideggerian critique, is there, but nevertheless, right, there's also, also a burning desire within. This is clear in Descartes, and I think it's, very clear in Spinoza, but it's very clear in Descartes. Is what they see is that the function of the scientific methods, there isn't a method, there are a family of methods, is to help people overcome self-deception, bias, prejudice. And in that way, let the world speak for itself. The experiment is a way in which the world can falsify any of your projections or your beliefs you bring to bear on it. And so I think in rejecting science, I see I see not enough concern with the possibilities of self-deception. And you talk about how it kind of fails, right? Because it gets lost in something that becomes very self-indulgent and celebrating the irrational, very broadly construed. So that's one. And then I want, if you could, to address that issue. And then Sophia means wisdom. And so, like, what's the wisdom that is being talked about in Sophia, and how does she connect with this overcoming of self-deception, the affording of self-transcendence? How does she connect to the beauty and the inexhaustible and the sacred? And my connection with Sophia is, I know quite a bit about her from Gnosticism, which you separate to some degree. And I also know a lot, I don't know if you're familiar with Raff's work, The Wedding of Sophia, ally work, The Alchemical Imagination. He's a post-Jungian, and he does a lot of work.
Oh yes, I do know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I may be mispronouncing his name. I've never heard it pronounced, so I'm just. Okay. And so these are, so for me, the binding theme there is wisdom, and that's of course the binding theme through all of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition. And so, how do you see here now? Very succinct now. Letting the world just appear. I'm a cognitive scientist. I firmly believe that means you're just going to bring to bear a whole bunch of unconscious biases, prejudices, self-deceptive machinery in a huge way. And of course, part of what Husserl's trying to do is a method for correcting for that. Exactly. And so there's a sense in which I get what you're saying, but there's a sense in which I want you to, if you could, unpack it more and address that concern, and then tell me how that connects up to wisdom and Sophia. I know that's a pretty big task, so you don't have to do it all at once, but that's kind of a road I'd like to travel down with you. If that makes sense.
So let me take the first part first. So, and I think, well, the romanticism, I think, you see how it kind of degrades into a goofy kind of Gothic sensibility, right? Yeah. And I think that's the problem with that kind of solipsism, right? Yep. Is it's all about me and my feelings. But I think what the Romantics were doing that was right on the money was that they were the only ones interrogating the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution.
Yes, yes.
No one in calling into question, saying, wait, what about feelings? What about, other kinds of things? Is everything materialistic? And I think that, and that leads into, I think Novalis, for instance, is, I think had he lived, he only died, he was 30.
Yeah.
Had he lived, it would be interesting to see what he would have arrived at, because he seems, and I think he impressed Goethe in the same way. He seemed like he was bringing something extraordinarily new to that movement. And he also had, I think, like you, he had a desire to be grounded in a tradition. It's like I've watched quite a few of your videos, or actually listened to them driving my kids back and forth from basketball practice. I think when you talk about your appreciation and I say reverence for the wisdom traditions of the world, right? And I think Novalis had that. In fact, one of the books that he wrote, which I'm supposed to write a foreword for it pretty soon, was Christendom or Europe, or sometimes it's called Christianity or Europe, which is a meditation on the same kind of things we've been talking about. What was lost when Christendom left Europe. And it's not about the Pope or about, the hierarchical order. It's about the community that was lost. The sense, the shared values and the conviviality that was in danger of being lost. And that's, I think, in Novalis's, I think it was his final work, the Hymns to the Night. If you've never read it, it's one of the most it's the ground zero of modern poetry. He breaks all the it's interesting. Part of it is in verse, part of it is his prose poems. And it's like he stayed in a tradition with the verse and broke out of it by moving into prose poems. Just like his kind of consciousness in that poem. The Sophia figure who appears in it, sometimes it's the Virgin Mary, and very, very much inspired by the Sistine Madonna.
Right.
And sometimes it's his deceased fiancée, whose name was Sophie, right? And in the way he draws that picture, which they kind of overlap and transmogrify into each other, it's pretty remarkable piece of writing. But I think what he was onto, and this goes to your question about Sophiology, and I think this is the important part with the self-deception, right? Is that, as Husserl said, being present to phenomena, right? How to bracket the Vervaeke, to bracket our assumptions about things. And I think also I would bring in Derrida here.
Yes, yeah.
With his, with difference, with not only the difference, but deferring.
Yeah, deferring.
Coming to a definition. This is why people say, "What's the definition for Sophiology?" I'm like, I'm still coming to it, right? Let's defer that, because I think that's problematic, and I think this is what Derrida's later work was all about. Is that once you come to a definition of something, you've already undermined your definition. So he was out. It's why what he was interrogating is that assumption that we can know and that language is sufficient to describe what we know. And I think that, I don't know what domain you want to move into, science as well as other domains. I think they also, and that because we're human beings doing these things, we all have self-deception,
of course,
in order to contend with. And I think this is what I think what's wonderful about the Romantic and Goethe's interrogation of the scientific method, and Bacon and so forth, and even Blake, right? Is that there are no easy answers, right? That we have to always contend with this. And in Sophiology, and this is what I would love to talk to you about this, maybe I have a question next, is the idea in this, and this goes back, I don't know if you're familiar with the Rosicrucian documents from the 17th century.
No,
but they were interesting in that they had a commitment to science, to natural philosophy, but to Christian tradition at the same time. And there were a number of figures in that part of history. Robert Flood, I read about in the Submerged Reality.
Yes.
And Thomas Vaughan, the alchemist and Anglican priest, and his brother Henry Vaughan, the metaphysical poet and physician, that they were trying to preserve, or not even say preserve, in a way they were kind of traditionalists, but they were also modernists for their era, because they liked science, they were interested in medicine, they wanted to heal people, but they didn't think that ignoring the spiritual dimensions of the creation was the way to go, right? And they could see that a materialist strain was coming, and that's why Thomas Vaughan dismissed Descartes' ideas as the whimsies of Descartes. Now, there was probably a misreading, or a little bit. He had a gift for bombast, but I think that's an interesting to me, and I think Goethe was trying to bring that back to a degree. You know, what would happen with we return? You could say eidetic if you would wish, but what happens if we bring the spiritual dimension back into the sciences, and we let the phenomenon speak to us in this way? Now, is self-deception still possible there? Absolutely, but it's an attempt, I think, to get at a deeper truth than the mechanical truth.
I agree with that. I suppose what I would say is, see, so for me, one of the pivot points that you get with Descartes is you get the proposal of universal method, the universal math, right? And the idea, the overreach for the scientific method was a loss of a previous idea. The previous idea, right, was, and you can see this change also happening in the theology of the time. The previous idea is there are truths that will only be disclosed to us after we undergo significant transformation, right? So you can't, you have to acquire virtue. You have to, perhaps have certain kinds of changes to your character, to your consciousness, and without those are absolutely irreplaceable for certain truths to be disclosed. So transformation, and transformation requires, again, I think ultimately a notion of a conformity epistemology. When that's thrown out with nominalism, you get instead the idea of the possibility of infinite calculation, that the universe can be, and then this gets taken up into Protestantism too, right? Where and to some degree, significant degree, Catholicism. But Luther's very deeply influenced by nominalism, whether or not he's a nominalist. Right.
It's there.
Calvin is very nominalistic.
Calvin is.
So, but anyways, before the point I'm trying to make is, okay, I get the critique. I take the critique very deeply that the loss of what you might call a transformational epistemology, which is replaced with a mechanical epistemology, just apply the method, the universal calculation. I get that. I think that's a very profound reason for making the critique. However, right, I know, right, first of all, my project is to try and bring those two together. That's explicit my project, spirituality and science. So, but I know as a scientist, I know how to criticize my fellow scientists. I know how to make it so that I will have to admit that I've made a mistake. I know how to do self-correction. I mean, so while I'm critical of the idea of the method, the scientific methods, one of the things it affords is it affords a community where the individuals can self-correct, the world can correct them, and they know how to correct each other. I don't see that gelling ever for the Romantics. I don't see them being, I mean, this is one of the things I think, criticize. They can never form a community in any coherent way that gives us access to the deepest ways in which we can challenge. I agree with you, Michael. There's no part of our cognition, our perception, that it's free from self-deception. That's one of the ways I interpret the first noble truth of Buddhism, right? Everything is threatened by dukkha. There's nowhere you can go that's free from that threat.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we can't be better than we are right now. I'm sorry, perhaps I'm losing the thread. What I'm saying is, right, I want to know what it would look like. Maybe I'm asking you something you can't deliver because it's unfair for me to ask you. But I've been impressed by your work, so I'm trying to draw you out. I want to know what it would look like for people to get into, right, that kind of individual and collective self-correction and transformation outside in a way that's analogous to that kind of result within the scientific project and the scientific method, right? And one of my concerns was that there used to be that, right? Like there used to be institutions where people did that. The monastic tradition, to my mind, was attempting to do this kind of thing. So that's a historical example. Do you see anything like that possible for us now? I guess the point I'm making is without something like that, without communities and communities of communities supporting these ecologies of practices of self-correction and self-transcendence, won't we just do the same thing that happened with Romanticism? Won't we just spiral again, inevitably towards narcissism?
I think it's a real danger. Yeah, and I'm glad you kept, because when you were speaking, the word that was going through my head was communities, right? Yes, and you talk about monasticism, but I also think, and I don't think this is true necessarily anymore, but I mean, you can look at the clerical orders of deacon, priest, and bishop, or compared to assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, right?
Yeah.
And I think the academic world mirrored, or at least did. I think that's actually based on that model, right? But I don't think academia. I don't know how it is at UT, but it's not like that anymore.
No, it's not. I agree with that.
And it's not that community where the open investigation about ideas. I mean, you're in the sciences, and I'm in the humanities, and it quickly, I started teaching college 20 years ago. It was okay. I mean, it was okay back then, but it quickly degenerated over the course of my career. And so that's why I started to go elsewhere. I started to look, I started to, like when I started the Center for Sophiological Studies, I'm trying actually to forge a community outside of academia.
Yeah.
And I think in a way we're doing that now in a way that does support and critique each other.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And that because if the project is, and I hope it is, to acquire wisdom, I think that's how it happens, is we share our insights and experiences and test them in conversation with other people, who also have that earnest interest. And the Romantics had this, I think, at the beginning. I think especially the German Romantics. The English Romantics were all on their own, basically. I mean, they were just a small community who weren't ever going to make an impact on anything. As popular as Wordsworth was at one time, there was just such a tiny fraction of people. But so yeah, I think, and this is Rudolf Steiner talked about this forming of new forms for these kinds of things, and I think it's time for that. I don't know if I'll be involved. I'll be long dead by the time that happens. Well, but you know what I mean? I think it's, I think that
well, you were at least fumbling toward it in Transfiguration, though.
Pardon me?
You were at least fumbling toward this in Transfiguration. That's what you're writing about in Transfiguration. So you're thinking about it.
When I wrote the book, I didn't think if the technocrats were going to take over so quickly. But yeah, I think if we had new forms outside of the traditional forms that could form, I mean, even going back to the Lyceum and the Academy, right?
Yeah.
And the Transcendentalists did the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think, and I don't know what it is about modern culture, but that seems to provide a forum for that, but not enough time. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make it clear that science is not untouched by this. We're suffering the replication crisis right now. At first, they thought it would be limited to psychology, and then it became clear that it was affecting all the social sciences and now the hard sciences,
Yeah.
so-called sciences. And to my mind, that's evidence that to uncouple knowledge from wisdom, it has been a serious mistake for the practice of science. I think that it's very strong evidence for that claim, and that a scientist, someone who aspires to know, should also be somebody who aspires to become wiser, more virtuous. I think those two are inseparably bound up together. So I just want to make clear that I wasn't privileging science from.
No, I know you weren't. I know you weren't. Well, the other thing, I think the humanities over the last 50 years have, especially in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, we're trying to be science.
Yeah, but
criticism from back then, it's kind of funny. They're trying to be scientific about the intuitive, which is kind of funny. I mean, they were imitating the methods of science and doing that. Well, I think what's his name, Noam Chomsky, and his grammatical structures, whatever the book was called, syntactical structures. I think that's what that was the death knell for English, for beautiful language.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I hadn't thought about that. That's and the part of the. For me, the line goes from Chomsky through to Fodor. And what happens is what's called first generation cognitive science, in which the Cartesian project comes to its full fruition in the computational theory of mind, that cognition is computation, and computation is something that's done in an abstract space. What we've gone through is two more generations. And cognitive science is now very critical of that approach. We have what's called 4E cognitive science. It's embodied, it's embedded, it's enacted, it's extended. I would add two more E's. It's emotional and it's exaptive. But those are, so it's a very, very different approach.
Well, you know what they say.
Pardon me?
What they say about English departments, right?
What?
That's where discredited theories from other disciplines go to die.
Oh. I'm sorry. I guess I don't know what to say, Michael. I was lucky. I'm in a science that has moved progressively towards a place. I mean, and not just me, lots of people. Gallagher, my friend Evan Thompson, Francisco Varela, the name, Dreyfus, and his work, like that, right? And how deeply it's influenced by Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and important aspects from Buddhism. So for me, I get to practice a science that, first of all, does a lot of history and philosophy of science, and that is trying to afford. Now, I want to be very careful here. Science can't give us what you and I are talking about, but what science could now perhaps give us is, after undergoing these transformations that it's undergoing right now, is perhaps give us better theories about the processes of meaning making and self-transcendence. I've run experiments in my lab on mystical experience and how it relates to meaning in life, and what are the cognitive factors that connect the two together, things like that. So for me, and this is why I'm so much interested in Neoplatonism, the possibility of reintegrating the cultivation of knowledge and the cultivation of wisdom, and this goes back to Varela and Dreyfus. That's very now pronounced. That's here and now, and it's happening. Of course, it should be subject to criticism and reflection and constraint, but nevertheless, I'm having a different. I'm saying that my experience is somewhat different from yours, and so I have a more optimistic view on, at least during certain days of the week. I have a more optimistic view. There's tremendous threats. There's we have not done any serious cultural reflection. There's some philosophical reflection. We haven't done any serious cultural reflection on the real possibility of autonomous artificial general intelligence, what that might mean I mean, you think the Industrial Revolution really shook up our self-conception, or Darwin's theory of evolution. If that project succeeds, that's going to be more titanic, I would predict, than Darwin or Galileo in unforeseeable ways. And what's really
and terrifying.
terrifying. And here's a critique I have, and this is somewhat similar to Jung's critique of the existing religious institutions. They are not taking up this problem in a foresightful manner at all, which is one of the reasons why I'm critical of their, and Nate knows that I do this with affection and respect and reverence, but I'm trying to make what I think is a legitimate criticism here. I'm critical of the existing, traditional world religions, is precisely they have not taken that project up in any really powerful way that I can see. And that, to me, that's a serious, I don't know what to call it, defect, lacuna right now.
I think that's a result of the ecclesial structures more than anything in the religions, though.
Yeah, well, can you say more to that? Because I'm open to.
Well, I think it's the same. This is the same reason that Michael lamenting about like what's happening in academia. Well, academia has become effectively an ecclesial structure for our age, right, and like every ecclesial structure before it, it has become corrupt, and it has kind of like spoiled its own project. And I think the same thing happens. I think the same thing happens in religions.
Do you think that's a very good proposal? It's a very Durkheimian proposal that I like. So Nate, are you saying that that part of the corruption is they also become sort of reactive and conservative as opposed to foresightful in their orientation?
Well, yeah, a good example of this would be Augustine, right? Look, if you look at Augustine, if you look at early Augustine, right, when the Augustine who's writing against Manichaeism and concedes the Privatio Boni and says that God so loves his creatures that he would never let any creature fall completely into non-being, right? That's early Augustine. Then what happens? He becomes a bishop. He becomes a bishop, and then he launches the Augustinianism that created or that inspired Calvin.
Yes.
So it's his position of power that is as a bishop that begins to alter his thinking.
So this means there's a real tension, right? Because there seems to be a pronounced need for community, and that community has to be organized, it has to be ordered, and it has to be capable of self-correction. And it seems like that needs to be instituted in some fashion, and yet that seems to lead to these ecclesiastical problems that you're pointing out.
It's kind of a tribalism.
Yes.
And I think it reminds me of something Rudolf Steiner said, apparently, that he said he wished that every day he could have a different word for anthroposophy, because people get so stuck on the word, and I think the same thing in these kinds of structures. It's, for some reason, it's got to be a structure that's unstructured. And because I've seen it so often in academic circles, right? Or even goes back to when Goethe was around, right? With the debates between the Neptunists and the Plutonists, right? Yeah. And which were basically knee-jerk reactions to a geological problem. And I already think I know what this is. So, and even Goethe was wrong on that one, by the way. But it's hard to avoid because, as Jung says someplace, and this is for Jung, this is a problem of persona, right? You're adopting the persona of whatever it happens to be, the feminist, the socialist, whatever. You hear Waldorf teacher, you get Birkenstocks, So how do you not be controlled by the persona or the egregore, right? This spirit generated by the group itself. How do you not be possessed by that?
But at times you want to be possessed by it, right?
Right? That's what Jung says, right? Jung says, but the persona is usually rewarded in cash.
But you want to be possessed. You want to be possessed by it when someone is actually expressing real authority, the kind of authority that 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 Jesus has when he's speaking at his bar mitzvah, right? When he's reading the scriptures, he speaks as one was authority. He's not there lording it over the other rabbis. No, he's speaking with it, like it's just like what he's saying is compelling of its nature. He doesn't. There's no need for coercion in what he's doing. It's just it's instinctively recognized.
And coming from the other direction, speaking of Jesus, right? You know, which I think is an overlooked statement, but when he says, "You're not far from the kingdom,"
exactly.
Right? You ever read? There's a children's book. I don't know if you have kids, but The Bronze Bow. What's by?
I have kids, but I don't know the book.
George. Pardon me?
I have kids, but I don't know the book. So
it's a great book, and it's about these zealots and Jewish revolutionaries in the time of Jesus, and they got it all figured out, right? It's revolution, and then this one kid whose father was killed by the Romans, his sister's insane, you know, he's just angry, and he explains to him. He meets Jesus and explains to him, you know, I'm just mad because this happened to my sister. I'm mad that this happened to my parents, you know, and I want to live. And Jesus just tells him, you know, you're not far from the kingdom, you know. So, which is to me, that kind of holding without hands, right? Which it's a holding in freedom. Right, which is what I think most of that's the danger in groups, in communities, is to, and this is one of the critiques of distributism, right, is that, you know, once you have a group that has a community, then somebody moves them in from out of town. Now you have an outsider, right? So like a village in the Middle Ages, right? And say a Muslim comes to town, what do they do then? You know, not that almost never happened, but you know, it's how to be open and connected at the same time, which is a very difficult task. You know, I think it's universal in every culture.
So I think that's right. I like Zach Stein's name for this. He calls it teacherly authority, which is the authority to teach.
Yeah.
And it's recognized. And then his point is you have to fundamentally change the educational system in order for teacherly authority to come to the fore again. Right now, we first of all, we used to have an ecology of institutions that helped prevent. We had the university, the monastery, and the church, and they all, you know, bounced off, and then they got separated. Right, and then the university got attached to the state, which, and you note that too, Michael, in your book. I remember noting that when I was reading it, and so what happens is education gets locked, and then the state gets locked to the market, and education gets locked to the market. But if you look across time and culture, the point of education is intergenerational. The responsibility is to the previous generation and to the next generation. The point of education is to try your virtuous best to carry out your responsibilities to your ancestors and your descendants. And the idea here is based on the deep truth that humans are unique in that we have cultural ratcheting. We do not have to learn from scratch.
Right.
We do not have to start from scratch the way all other organisms have basically innate, and then they have to learn it, and they have to do it again. And there's a little bit of cultural transmission amongst chimps and bonobos, right? But that's about it. Maybe elephants, maybe crows, but it's but we excel in it. And the point was that education was a deep responsibility to the generations and to that ultimate phenomena of cultural ratcheting. And the point is, I don't think we can. I mean, I'm not making a foreclosure argument. I think it's improbable that teacherly authority will emerge in any consistent or coherent fashion while we still have an education system that has been orphaned and then sacrificed to the state.
Yeah.
And I'm exploring this actually with a series I'm doing with Layman Pascal and Brendan Dempsey Graham about, you know, do we need something like the ecology of institutions that support an ecology of practice in order to give us our best attempt. Again, I'm not proposing an algorithm here, because I don't think anybody can, but our best attempt to address this issue we're putting our finger on right now. So for me, the things I like about science and democracy when they're working, and I believe with Dewey that they have to be interwoven to work, and they have to be woven with something else, but I won't get into that, is this tremendous dynamical self-organizing capacity. And I'm wondering if we can do, if it's possible to do that without an ecology of institutions, something analogous to the church, the monastery, and the university, bouncing off against each other, criticizing each other. I don't know. That's a question, I guess I'm asking.
Well, I think we've witnessed that. Although we're watching it now, those old forms are all breaking down.
Yes.
Right now, I mean, the church and the university are breaking down. Right, monasticism broke down a long time ago, but the church, I mean, all the churches are breaking down right now. And that's, I mean, it's kind of in a way, it's an exciting time to do that, right? But without having the next thing in place yet. I mean, I write about this more thinking about the education of children, but I also, it applies to grown-ups, like the academy. Is that the idea of the hedge school, right? Which is outside of the state. The hedge schools were, I don't know if you know, they were in Ireland under British rule, and the Irish did not want their children to be educated by the crown. So they formed these, what they called hedge schools. They didn't actually take place as hedges, but they were probably in barns, where they would, the community, and this is actually happening right now in small ways in different places, where a group of parents in a village would scratch together some money or food or whatever and pay a schoolmaster to teach their kids. Right? And they would teach them Irish and Irish history rather than British history, and teach them Greek and Latin or whatever it happened to be. And it was very much tailored to what the needs of the community were. So they might even teach navigating, right? So I think that offered, when I was writing Transfiguration, that offered me a little hope, discovering that, reaching back into my Irish roots, and thinking, it is possible to do this.
Well,
but it's going to take some time.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Go ahead.
Thomas Bjorkman has done, he wrote The Nordic Secret. I forget who the co-author is, and I call it about, the building movement in Scandinavian countries, in which, the Scandinavian countries a while back are very authoritarian, agrarian. They're basically very static societies. Economically, they're not doing well, etc. And then they basically set up, and this is, I think, the closest approximation I could use to describe it. They set up a network of secular monasteries where people go for 2 or 3 years after university, and they basically do philosophy as a way of life, very, very much Pierre Hadot kind of thing. And they wrestle with these questions, because the idea was that is the kind of education that will support intergenerational transformation and will afford democracy. And what happened is that movement actually inseminates those societies, and they go from being, what they were to what they are now, which is, it's a radical transformation. Now, the irony is the success is killing the very thing that bred the success, which often happens. These secular monasteries have been largely neglected for a couple generations. But that's a clear historical example of the ability to do something like we're talking about. Now, what's interesting to me, and I agree with you, is that people are setting this up. I was talking to Daniel Thorson and Seixin. They're setting up Willow, which is basically, it's deeply influenced by Buddhism, but it's ultimately a secular monastery outside of Toronto. And there's a network of those. There's a lot of people there's a lot of grassroots generation of something at least strongly analogous to this movement that historically, undoubtedly, transformed Scandinavian society in a powerful way. I'm very excited about this. I get involved with these communities and try and build them together.
Well, I think that's really important. I mean, because we have a tendency to get caught in this like way of thinking that like government is the only possible mechanism for human cooperation, right? So it's just like we keep waiting to like elect the Messiah, essentially, to lead us, you
Yeah.
know, into the eschaton instead of just like focusing on cooperating together to create beautiful things.
Let's do it now. Yeah. Village.
Well, I grew up in the, I was in high school in the late 70s, and so the police, the rock, and I often say, the first line from Spirits in the Material World, right? There is no political solution, and I think that's because politics is ideological. It's locked at the propositional level. It's very nominal. It is so like deeply woven with these cultural cognitive grammar, the cultural cognitive grammar that's driving the meaning crisis. I do not think that is the arena. And so that's why I talk about what I call stealing the culture. That what we need to do is there's not going to be a revolution. And Michael, I like that line in your book. I don't even remember what you said. Then all we got was a revolution after a revolution after a revolution, and it doesn't go anywhere. And that is also a lesson I've learned from history. It's like the idea that but the next one, I'm tired of that because they drench the world in blood,
yeah.
right?
Oh, wait, absolutely. Yeah. The next one's going to be the one.
Yeah. And so I want to do something analogous to what Buddhism did in India and what Christianity did in the Roman Empire. There wasn't a new economic proposal or a takeover. There wasn't a political revolution. There was the creation of ecologies and practices, the Eightfold Path, right? The way of agape. There's communities, and then communities of communities, and a new way of being is made available and afforded to people. And the beauty of that is exemplified much more than it's spoken of. And I think that is the way in which we're going to.
But those are all driven by a different kind of idea of truth. It's an idea of truth that sees truth as that which has the power to transform.
But that is the core of the conformity theory, as opposed to the representational theory of truth. Right. And this, Heidegger gets close to it. If Heidegger hadn't turned on Plato, I think he would have made. I agree with Rosicrucian. I think he would have got to this point, and I agree with Rosicrucian. He probably would not have gotten involved with the Nazis, but that's another argument. But because he gets close to the idea of aletheia as this disclosure, but and the moment of truth, and it has something to do with the power of being. But he's not quite. But the conformity theory, really locks that in. It's right. It's because ancient epistemology, like Gerson, it's the inverse of us. Right? We start in here, and how can I possibly know, right? And we were trying to work out whereas, the Greek model is intelligibility must be presupposed, right? And then what must the world be like such that it is intelligible? And you work your way in. It's a fundamentally different thing. And when you're doing that, you think of the power of truth to reach you, to disclose, to transform you, and that you have to conform to it, rather than what we have, which is, I'm just going to build, John Locke, I'm sitting inside a little room and I'm getting postcards from the world and I'm trying to assemble them to figure out what the world is, which is a ridiculous proposal. You will never get out of that room, right? You're trying to build the thing that is precisely lacking, right? It's doomed to failure. And that's why both the rationalists and the empiricists end up in profound skepticism.
And I think what we're talking about here is a kind of sustainable human education, right? And so for instance, I'm a biodynamic farmer, so we have a very small farm, 10 acres altogether. I think we garden about an acre, but it's enough to feed 50 families for at least 6 months.
Wow.
But it's because it's sustainable, right? And we don't use any power tools. I mean, once in a while I have to use a rototiller, but in general it's all hand tools. And it's amazing how, and doing this, I think we're almost here for 7 years, how healing it is for the land, first of all, how nutritious the food becomes after doing this, and how, especially since we don't use pesticides or fungicides or anything, how the ecology of, so our farm is in the corner of a wilderness area. So there, you see this cycle, and I should say almost a network or something of the reciprocity between us as the stewards of this land and the land as stewards of us. But I think the same thing you're talking about in terms of education is it's a kind of sustainable, and it's the thing is it's outside of the technocratic and governmental, and it's self-directed, it's hands-on, right? Which is, for instance, I got a call last week from one of our person who was in our CSA, and she knew I used to be a Waldorf teacher, and
yes,
her children were in a Waldorf teacher, or in a Waldorf school in Detroit where I used to work. And the school, a lot of schools around here don't have mask mandates for the children anymore, but some do, and the Waldorf school was, and they really were clamping down on kind of community kinds of things, which is what a Waldorf school does best. Mm-hmm. And so the parents got fed up and they took the kids out of the school. They were going to homeschool, but they found a young man, I think he might be in his 30s, but he was a student of mine 30 years ago. And he started educating them outside of that. So he has a class of, 7 or 8 kids. The parents pay him to give their children an education. And that it's kind of inspiring to me, because it just shows that, if there's a will, there's a way. That, and as I say in Transfiguration, it's, you don't have to do it all at once. Just do what you can,
Yeah, I really, that was inspiring to me. Like the kind of like the start where you are kind of thing, which reminded me of like Malcolm Guite's poem, like The Singing Bowl.
I don't know that poem. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
So I agree, and Nate knows it, but Michael, I'm very suspicious and critical of utopians and utopias.
I'm not a utopian.
No, and I didn't think you were. But I just wanted to. So
yeah.
But so I'm very attracted to. Paul van der Klee has a nice. He talks about dead reckoning, and Jordan Peterson tries to say something similar with, well, if you've got clarity what you're moving away from, right? Can you at least do that, and then do it again, and then do it again, and do it again. And I think there's value to that notion. And again, if you take a look, I don't want to come off as the person I'm not here, but if you take a look at the nuns, NONES, the demographics,
right?
The established religion, they're not. Most of them are not Sam Harris atheists. They're not reject religion because they. It's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of belonging. They do not feel they belong. They do not feel they belong, and they do not feel that the religions are meeting them or helping them or drawing them in. And here's a way I would put it:
because they're not.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, they're not. And these religions are no longer beautiful to them.
Yeah, this is where I think Michael and I would agree, where maybe Paul wouldn't. So, yeah.
But so I guess the question is then, well, I'll ask you a question, because I take you, Nate, I know you self-identify as a Christian. Michael, do you, I take it you consider yourself a Christian, or is that more open for you?
I do consider myself a Christian, but it's still more open.
Yeah, I think we're both probably would be fair to say we're both Christian perennialists.
Right.
So
okay. I'm not trying to label you or dismiss you. I'm just trying to know how to frame my question. And so, given some of these critiques, and given what we both seem to agree with the problem that the nuns are facing, right? Do you think? And this is an honest question. I'm not setting you up for a semantic jiu-jitsu move or anything like that. Do you think the existing religions can reformulate themselves to meet these people? I do not deny that individuals can return to their religions and find self-transcendence, wisdom, meaning in life, connection, community. I'm not denying that, and I never will deny that. That's not my question. My question is not about specific individuals. My question is almost like a demographic question. Mm-hmm. Do you think the existing, right, religions, and you can, if you want to just speak about Christianity, that's fair, and that's fine, and I understand. Do you think there is a real possibility that they will reformulate themselves in a way to address these problems?
Yes, but I think the institutions are beyond hope.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, but my thought is that if that and I'm thinking, you know, coming up from a Catholic background or Orthodox, Anglican, is that people take the power away from the bishops, right? That stop imagining that this ecclesial order has some kind of you know, governmental sanction. And even though I know that might cause trouble, but I think back to the early Christian communities, or even in the medieval Christian communities, or the early modern ones, they were so far removed from the power structures that they were basically doing their own thing. Which is, I think, Robert Harrick's a great example, that his religion, though Christian, certainly had a lot of Latin pagan elements to it, as well as folk religion, you know, English folk religion with the maypoles and hot carts and all this business, right? So to me, that offers a lot of hope. That kind of messy Christianity offers hope. Not that what happens though is but
messy, that is the but to me, here's the thing.
Christianity asserts right. itself. Usually they call a church council to clamp down on them, right?
Yeah. But it's buried there. Like it's in the, like that's in the faith. That's like I think in a lot of ways, John, what you're trying to do, Jesus already did. Like to me, like Christianity already is what you're trying to, like Christianity already is the religion that's not a religion. Like it was already something that tried to create a spiritual system that was not bound by culture, place, and time.
Yeah.
Right.
Isn't that what
it was intended to be a universal spirituality accessible to all. That's what it was. And that's what the core of it is. So it doesn't, and that core doesn't need these ecclesial structures. It just doesn't. In fact, the ecclesial structures get in the way of it because they are opposed to that message, because it undermines their power.
Well, and I don't know if you were alluding to this on purpose, Nate, but Derrida's proposition, I think it's in The Gift of Death, of a religion without religion, right?
Yeah, I did not realize that he had. I mean, I've read quite a bit of Derrida, and I've actually purchased a book recently. I haven't started reading it specifically on Derrida's relationship to religion. I've read some of his stuff in his relationship to negative theology.
Yeah,
and
I watched your interview with Jordan Peterson yesterday, and you were talking about Derrida.
Yes.
And I realized in my dissertation, which was later published, I remember when I was compiling the bibliography, and outside of the primary sources I used, the one source I cited more than anybody else was Derrida. And I wrote in my books basically on negative theology in early modern English literature. So I did a lot with John Donne, and Derrida is a big fan of John Donne and negative theology. And so, I mean, to me, the latter Derrida is a negative theologian.
I agree, and I think so. And that was the point I was trying to make to Jordan. And the latter Foucault is deeply influenced by Hadot and Stoicism, right? And so, just dismissing the postmodernist to core, I think it's inept. And I think there should be. I think we should respond to arguments with arguments, and we should read people at their best, And I think for me, the issue I have with Derrida is I think he was struggling to get outside of, as you said, propositional, the reduction of knowing to propositions. But I think he was struggling to get. He was still bound to the notion. Well, sorry, it looks to me like he was bound to the notion of the text. There's still a semiological reductionism in him that I think was preventing him from seeing the transformative practices that would need to be. Negative theology is not primarily a propositional practice.
That's actually Catherine Pickstock's criticism of Derrida in After Writing is precisely that criticism.
Yeah,
and she tries to recover like the sense of orality that's in like the Phaedrus.
Yes,
which is like one of the two texts that she's using to in that work. So
because I think, I mean, I made this argument a long time ago, and I'm willing to make it again. I think there are significant similarities between Derrida's notion of difference and my notion of relevance realization. I think they are very, very similar in important ways. So I think just dismissing him I think he was on. So two things I think he was on. I think there's that similarity. And I think that he's got the deep intuition, which I've tried to articulate and explicate to some degree. There's deep connections between this process of relevance realization and our experience of meaning and our experience of sacredness, etc. And I think he's reaching towards that. It's funny about these influences that people don't know about. You know, Camus wrote his dissertation on Christian Neoplatonism, right? And that's why the light imagery is so pronounced through so many of Camus' work, right? Especially L'Étranger, but also, right, there's you can see it in The Plague as well.
Yeah, so it came right to mind.
Yeah,
you mentioned it.
So I mean, I do think that there's a lot that's going on that is, and I get why you mentioned Derrida. I mean, we're deconstructing. The problem with deconstruction is it is a parasitic practice, right? So I'm trying to ask. So I'll rephrase my question, not because you didn't answer it. I'm trying to be sort of Socratic and go further and draw it out, right? So you don't want revolution, and so I assume you don't want revolution in the church. That's not what you're talking about. And you don't want just deconstruction, because deconstruction isn't going to do it. So what is the change? I'm sorry, and feel free to speak vaguely and at the precipice of the horizon of your intelligibility, because I may be pushing you there. But what is the kind of change you see is needed then? Because
I'll give you an example.
Okay, please.
So through the pandemic, so we would go to church, but once the pandemic started, we didn't. And I have at the time I had 5 kids still at home. I'm down to 4 now. And so we decided finally, well, let's do church at home. So we took it into our own hands. And then my brother-in-law moved nearby. So we joined with them every Sunday to have church. And it's a really good experience of church, because it's intimate. You know everybody. I mean, my problem with institutional Christianity is very often you go into these churches, they're huge, you don't know anybody, right? You don't feel part of a community. You get a box of envelopes. You know what I mean? So I think that's one answer. I mean, that was, for us, it was a very practical answer to what we thought of as a very real problem. Or even with having, like, I know some people, since this pandemic started, have not let their children play with other children.
Yeah.
Right. Which that's going to be damaging, psychologically damaging and socially damaging down the line. I have to assume, right?
Oh, it is. The mental health tsunami is coming. It's already starting, and it's coming, and it's going to get worse. Very much. The Great Resignation is in part a massive response to the way COVID sort of made stark the meaning crisis for a lot of people in very powerful ways.
Right. And I think that for me, I mean, there was a crisis for meaning for us, and that was a way to address it.
Right.
Is it the way to address it? I don't know, but it was a way to address it.
Right. I think Paul Vanderklay's Estuary project is also like pretty good, which I've been personally involved in. I'm gonna be hosting an estuary group at my church starting in December.
Yeah.
I'm lucky enough to be part of a very small Anglican church that like tolerates my very open heterodox kind of meanness. So it's not really a problem for me. So it's a very small, close community, so I'm lucky in that way. But I'm also very hyper aware of like how other people have this need to be connected to this. And I think what Paul is doing with Estuary is actually a really good move in that direction.
That's a good point.
Because like in practice, since I've been participating in it through the Estuary host conversations, like it has a lot of resemblances to kind of like what goes on in AA to a certain degree, right? Which is actually like, I think there's a lot for the church to learn from that. And you don't have to be someone who suffers from drug addiction or alcoholism to benefit from what AA is doing. Or to have something that functions in that model that is open to anyone who wants to come is a good thing. So,
or perhaps the Eightfold Path as an ecology of practices.
Sure.
There's some preliminary evidence, and so that's all it is, but it is evidence nevertheless that rehabilitation programs based on the Eightfold Path model do better than the 12-step model, just generally. And so, I mean, I think we should be really empirical, and in that sense, scientific about the proposal of these.
Well, what causes the results is spiritual transformation. So maybe more people are able, for whatever, in my opinion, I think it's spiritual transformation that is actually whatever it is that people they're coming into contact with spiritual transformation through AA or the Eightfold Path or whatever it is. And the truth of the matter is we might need different models for different people.
I think it's highly plausible. I think demographic pluralism is a reality, and certainly if we're dealing with trauma, we should have we should have a rich repertoire of programs available for people. I totally agree with that. But that again, that's a different. We're now proposing a different kind of institutional structure than we have done typically in the past.
Yeah.
Typically, we have here's our program, sign on or get lost, right? And that I think we have. I think there needs to be a lot more flexibility, given the fact that we are now, I think, coming to accept the significant differentiation between people. How they come to the real possibility of transformation. There's a lot of variation in how that happens, and I think denying that, the time for denying that has passed. And so that's interesting. I should talk to Paul more about that. I like the fact that there were people from there's a Discord community that is set up around my work and my project. And then Paul's community, and they have entered into, Paul and I did a thing together with bridging between them, and they have entered into what I think could properly be called fellowship. They reinforce each other, they support each other, they explore each other, they challenge each other, they self-correct, or they correct each other and drive each other to self-correct. I'm really, really pleased with that. I had nothing to do with that, and that again speaks to me that there's a lot of people are I like this Latin word inventio, which means about to discover and make. There's the inventio of these new ways, and it's just popping up all over the place. And again, the fact that the mainstream media and our political machinery is completely indifferent and blind to this, the fact that they can't even, like, they won't even describe the Great Resignation as the Great Resignation. They're starting to now, but for a long, it was a labor shortage. No. People are doing, there's not some abstract lack of a resource. There's a lot, there's millions of people basically saying we want more meaning, and more importantly, we're willing to take a hit in our standard of living if it gives us the promise of more meaning.
Yeah.
And they're not paying attention to that. They're not paying attention to that at all.
Well, I don't think they can. I just don't think the structures allow for it. It's just
you could be right.
Well, and I think it's an impoverishment of education too. I mean,
yes,
I think, they haven't, like you were talking about, in fact, when I taught philosophy at a Catholic college. The book I started in my intro to philosophy course was Hadot.
Right.
Philosophy is a Way of Life.
Oh, great book.
And because, I noticed, and I was teaching in an inner city Catholic college with mostly Black students, and they were totally into those questions.
Yes. Yes.
They would just, wow, I'm waiting for somebody to ask me these things,
Yes.
And so it was really, and people are starving for it. But I think, so many of the people in, they're probably in their 30s and 40s in education or in journalism now, they haven't had those questions. They haven't had that grounding generally.
Well, because we haven't seen questions about personal transformation and meaning as practical questions, when they're the most practical questions that there really are.
Yeah, it's been replaced by GDP, right? But I have a question. This is like a little off topic, but I was, I know, John, your interest in Neoplatonism. Would you describe yourself as a Neoplatonist?
I describe myself as a post-nominalist Neoplatonist.
Okay.
I think I don't think we can just go back to the Neoplatonism before nominalism.
I have a question then, and because this touches on Sophiology. What is your take on the world soul, the idea of the world soul?
So I think it's, for me, I take it that the universe is recursively self-organizing in a tremendously fractal and almost incomprehensible way. And that is very much, I think, at least the scientific analog of what the world soul was. Let me try and do it a little bit more, right? I think I'm a little bit, not peeved. Materialism is, first of all, they often confuse corporeality with materialism, right? Which is a mistake. And then they confuse materialism with, there's patterns, right? And scientists believe in patterns, E equals MC squared, right? And the thing about that is that's not an event, that's not an object, it's not located right here or there. It's a real structuring of possibility that constrains how things emerge. So this is not my Neoplatonism is in this sense very much like Erigena. I think of a complete interpenetration of emergence and emanation, and at all levels. And this is a terrifically this expresses itself in a terrific, a terrifically complex and I think ultimately beautiful form of self-organization. For me, that's what's meant by the world soul. The universe, in a sense, is as much responsible for its existence as anything else is, if I can put it that way. I'm not arguing for pantheism. What I mean is, let me give you an analogy. One of the things we're discovering, and it's odd that it's becoming discovery, right? As we adopt the idea of cognition as inherently dynamical and developmental, is that you as a self-organizing thing play a big role in your development. Now, I know that sounds like, of course, but it took a while to get there where we now, and that's what I'm trying to say. The universe plays a big role in its development at multiscalar levels. And so for me, that whole vertical of emanation and emergence and the horizontal, directing itself.
Well, so John, I can't hate when you say that. I can't help but think of Emil Book, the anthroposophist, whose text we've been analyzing on my channel. In one of his discussions of Revelation, he sees the 144,000 singing the new song in Revelation as a participation in that co-creation of the new heaven and the new earth.
Yeah,
there's a role to be played by human consciousness in that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways, I think so. I mean, one of the ways of responding to, sort of a general statement, said in general about our sort of cosmological insignificance is to move from a quantitative analysis to a qualitative one, right? Where we may be small causally, but in terms of disclosing the possibilities of being, we are really, really important. We are really, really important, such that I can say this without even a hesitation of thought. Do I want a universe with or without life? With life. There you go. There's because that was easy. And do I want to, right? And do I want a universe with or without intelligent life? Again, intelligent life. Why? Because right, there's the capacity. I'm not trying to make even a weak anthropomorphic argument here, but there is the disclosure in us of being, and in that sense, I think we can participate in the sacred in a way that other beings can't, and therefore we have a special responsibility. Right. I think that's part of what reverence is. Reverence is that, first of all, not how things are relevant to me, how am I relevant to them, and does that relevance carry with it a sense of responsibility? I think that's what reverence properly is. And so I think our capacity for genuine reverence makes us qualitatively important to disclosing the possibilities of something like the world soul. I don't typically use that word, but I'm using it because you introduced it, Michael. Like sometimes this actually happens to me, and it's an aesthetic experience, but it's more than an aesthetic experience. I'll see a cat go by. My partner has cats, and she's really converted me. I really love cats now. I used to think of them as land sharks with brains, but now, right. There's this one cat, and he's an amazing. But the cat goes by, and I think, what? And see how this is like the Greek question about being. But I ask, what must the universe be like such that it can produce a cat? Like what? That reveals something about it that isn't revealed in sort of the nuts and bolts of chemistry, or even the nuts and bolts of certain parts of biology, etc. There's something more that's being disclosed there, and so that's my answer to you, Nate. I hope that made some sense. Yeah. So did Michael? Did this address your question?
Disclosure. Pardon me.
Did my answer address your question?
No, I was investigating your work. I thought, what do you think about this? Because a lot of people do compare the idea of Sophia to the world soul, and I thought it'd be a good point of intersection. And but I think what you're talking about, this idea of disclosure that Heidegger really talks about quite a bit, right? Yeah. But he also, I think Heidegger in Being and Time offers a great model for this. With this, if you think in stages as first the being hurled towards death,
yes,
then the disclosure, right? When you finally drop all the persona, and what arises from that, for Heidegger, he calls it care, right?
Yes.
And but reverence, I think, is also an adequate term for that. It's analogous to his idea of care, because when you get to that place as a human being, your disposition towards the world has changed.
And that's it. Like when Socrates is asking the what is question, he's not asking a question of curiosity. He's not seeing, like in curiosity, your cup is half filled, and you want to fill it up so that you can repair your knowledge. But wonder is you empty your cup more, right? You empty your cup more. What is it? What is it? Because he's trying. There's often in the dialogues, there's no answer, precisely because there is no answer to be given. What you see, you can see some of his interlocutors realizing, is that what's being cultivated is right relationship, right? The right relationship to other people and the right relationship to being itself.
Yes.
And I think, again, but here's my criticism of Heidegger. Heidegger does this, he talks it, but there's nothing in Heidegger about, and this, this is a Hadot critique, there's nothing in there about the practices.
Right.
Like what do you do? My friend, Guy Senstock, created circling. He created the whole, and this has become a movement, because he was trying to figure out how to put Heidegger into practice, right? And so there was that's a real problem that. And I also don't like Heidegger's Heidegger builds a mystique around himself that I find very, very off-putting. I'm the great thinker, and I can never completely disclose my thoughts to you. Okay.
But I think he does offer a kind of practice in his writings on poetry, which is where I first caught it, right? Mm-hmm. I saw where he was going.
Oh,
in his writings on poetry.
No, that's a very good point, Michael. Yeah. I suppose then.
And to me, that's not trivial, because poetry really is prayer. Like it just is. Like that is exactly what poetry is. And it doesn't matter like what, no matter what. And what's interesting is that different kinds of poems can be different kinds of prayers too.
Yes.
So it's like you know, a Bukowski poem is no less a prayer than a George Herbert poem. They're all an attempt to communicate with being.
And
Or communing with
understand how
Yeah.
and to understand how you relate to it.
And Heidegger is he's preoccupied with Holderlin, right? Which is, I think, an important location, because Holderlin also does not give any answers like Socrates,
Which is good.
He's investigating, it's an exploration. It's an opening, but it's not conclusive.
That's one of the defining differences between the dialogical and the monological approach. The monological approach seeks cognitive closure and the completion of the treatise. The dialogical approach, to use James Carr's terms, is trying to bump us into the infinite game, right? Rather than the finite game. I hadn't thought about that. That's a very tasty thing you just did, Michael. The poetry. Yeah. And the poetry is poesis and prayer.
Yeah.
Like the deep meaning of poesis. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Thank you for that. Yeah.
It kind of ties us back to like the Goethe's approach to science too, because part of what Goethe's approach to science is he's very dubious of like that we can have these kind of fixed axioms because he thinks it's too dynamic, that it's always just like, this is the best we can manage at this moment.
So I agree with that, but you have to be careful because you can create axioms to give you ways of thinking that are dynamic and open. Like you just have to have the right attitude towards
right, but we have to remember that they're axioms.
Yes, exactly.
And because they become problematic when we forget that they're axioms, which is to me ties to what you were talking about the qualitative and the quantitative. Like we axiomatically posited like a sort of quantitative infinity that I don't think is real. And we need to remember that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a lot, both reading and philosophical reflection and Lectio Divina with Nicholas of Cusa around that. And he has this I just read this great passage where he says, okay, do the absolute maximum and do the absolute minimum. And then he says, now remove quantity from that. Exactly. And then I go, what? Okay, and I'm doing it, and I get it, and I get a sense, right? And you get this evocation, and I was thinking of Heraclitus as the way up and the way down are the same way. And I'm thinking, oh, right, one is the movement this way, and the others but they're actually just the same space of movement, if you'll allow me the metaphor. And it's like, and he says, you can get a sense of moving towards the coincidence of the opposites, which is like really, really profound. Yeah. But again, it's like, I think you like, I don't know. I don't think you can read Nicholas of Cusa without doing the practices that he's actually recommending.
Right.
Like he's recommending all kinds of practices and the same thing. Or you can't read Spinoza without actually practicing what he's talking about in the ethics. And the same thing with the Tao Te Ching. I think if you're not doing Tai Chi Chuan, Qi Kong, you don't really get the Tao Te Ching. That's like endlessly reading the Kama Sutra and never getting naked. Right, right.
I know a lot of people like that, but
gentlemen, I need to get going soon.
Oh well, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this.
It was a great pleasure meeting you, Michael.
Nice to meet you too, John.
You gave me lots of thought. I'm going to continue to read your work.
Yeah.
And that last point you gave me, not just single it out unfairly, but that was a very good point. Thank you for that. Thank you. That's much appreciated.
It was my pleasure meeting you, and your work's inspiring to me. And this conversation was.
I'm so glad that you guys were able to talk. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to now thank you, Nate, and I would like to extend an invitation to both of you at some point when it's convenient. Perhaps come on to Voices with Vervaeke.
Sure. Yeah, and I can send you the footage for this if you want to.
Well, I'll post this on my channel under Voices with Vervaeke, but I meant an individual one with you, Nate, an individual one with you, Michael.
Great.
I would like that. I want to shine a light on as many people as I can. I really do want people to see distributed cognition at work rather than me or him or her. I want to see, because for me, that's one of our best bets against the, the idealization or idolization, perhaps is an even better word, of particular individuals. Because what that does is, first of all, that creates all kinds of possibilities of moral vice and etc. But it also tends to strangle the people who are generating the ideas. They start to conform to the persona that is loved by their audience, kind of thing.
They become their own avatars.
Yeah, and I understand there's a balance there. You do have a responsibility to the people that you've educated. There's a teacherly authority, and you have to undertake. You can't just suddenly, oh, I'm over here. I get that, right? Yeah. You can't be wanton because you have a responsibility. Just like you can't be wanton as a parent, right? There has to be a through line. But on the other hand, like people get, like you said, they get bound in. They identify with their avatars too strongly. So it's a long way of saying it's very important to me to share as much as possible.
Yeah, I totally respect that spirit. That's why I do like basically zero solo content on my channel. It's always conversations. So.
Well, I'm going to keep doing the dialogical stuff, and I've been presenting quite a few series. I'm going to have another monological series because I'm after Socrates is going into production. But I try to counterbalance it by all these dialogical series that I do. Anyways, I need to get going.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Much appreciation. In all the various meanings of appreciation. Much appreciation, and thanks for this.
Thank you. Thank you, Nate.